The morning Matilda Kendrick rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, not a single soul on the main street stopped long enough to remember her face. That was the truth of it, plain and simple, and she had grown so accustomed to that particular truth that she barely flinched anymore when eyes slid past her like water off oiled leather. She was 24 years old, with brown hair the color of creek mud after a good rain, and eyes that were neither green nor gray, but something in between that no one had ever thought to name. Her nose was straight, her mouth was set in a line that people mistook for severity, when really it was just the expression of a woman who had learned very early that the world did not slow down for her benefit. She was not ugly. She was not beautiful. She was the kind of woman that men looked at and then looked through, and she had made her peace with that fact somewhere around the age of 16, when the last of the Caldwell boys who had come calling had gone and married the Delaney girl instead. She had not come to Caldwell looking for anything romantic. She had come because her father's land was here, because his grave was here, and because the bank in Wichita had sent a letter saying that if she did not arrive within 30 days to settle his accounts and take possession of the property, they would sell it to cover the debts he had left behind. $47 and some change was all that stood between her and destitution, and the land her father had left her was either the answer to every problem or the beginning of new ones. She did not yet know which. The wagon she drove was borrowed from her neighbor back in Ellsworth, Mrs. Prentice, who had lent it with the agreement that Matilda would return it within 2 months or send word. The horse pulling it was a roan mare named Clover who had seen better days but still had spirit, and Matilda respected her for that. She pulled up to the livery stable at the end of Kisham Street and climbed down from the wagon bench with the careful movements of a woman whose joints ached from 3 days of hard road. The livery man came out wiping his hands on a cloth, glanced at her, assessed the wagon and the horse, and said he would take the horse for the night for 15 cents. 12, Matilda said. 13. Done, she said, and handed over the coins. She took her traveling bag from the wagon bed and walked the length of the main street toward the hotel, and nobody watched her go. Caldwell in 1878 was a cattle town at the height of its ambition. The Kisham Trail still pushed longhorn cattle through in enormous quantities, and the town had grown accordingly, with saloons and boarding houses and a dry goods store and a telegraph office, and a new courthouse still being finished at the north end of town. There was dust everywhere always, and the smell of cattle and horses and wood smoke and leather, and somewhere behind one of the saloons a man was playing a fiddle badly. It was loud and it was busy and it smelled like work, and Matilda had always liked that about frontier towns. They did not have time to be cruel in refined ways. Their cruelties were quick and practical, and at least you could see them coming. She took a room at the Carver Hotel, which was clean enough, and asked the woman at the desk, a Mrs. Edna Carver herself as it turned out, where she might find the offices of the First Bank of Caldwell. 2 blocks north, Mrs. Carver said, looking at Matilda with the evaluating eyes of a woman who had seen every kind of traveler pass through. But Mr. Forsythe will be at the courthouse most of the day. He is on the town council and they are arguing about the water rights again. You can probably catch him at the bank by 4 o'clock. Thank you, Matilda said. She went up to her room and washed the road off her face and hands, changed into her better dress, which was still practical wool in a deep blue that had faded some from washing, and then sat on the edge of the bed with her father's papers spread on the blanket beside her. She read through them again, as she had read through them a dozen times on the road. The land was 80 acres, 12 of which were workable by her estimate, the rest being hard rocky ground and a dry creek bed. The cabin her father had built was there, and a well, and a small barn. The debts against it were not insurmountable if she could get a single good season in, but she would need seed money, and she would need help working the land, and she was one woman alone in a county full of men who looked right past her. She folded the papers carefully and put them back in the leather satchel. Outside her window, Caldwell continued its loud and dusty business, and a train whistle sounded in the distance, and Matilda sat very still for a moment and made herself breathe. She had always done this, made herself breathe when things felt too large. Her mother had taught her that. Her mother, who had been gone since Matilda was 11, who had been a practical woman of great competence and no particular prettiness, and who had managed everything with a kind of quiet ferocity that Matilda had been trying to imitate her whole life. You breathe, her mother used to say, and then you get up, and then you do the next thing. So Matilda breathed, and then she got up, and then she went to find something to eat before her meeting with the banker. The restaurant attached to the hotel was a long, narrow room with 6 tables, and at 4 of them there were already men eating and talking loudly. She took the table nearest the window and ordered the chicken stew, which was good, and ate it alone with the particular composed dignity of a woman who had eaten alone a great many times in her life. 2 of the men at the other tables glanced at her when she came in, and then went back to their conversations. The 3rd table held a man eating with his hat still on, which she found rude, and the 4th held 2 cowboys whose spurs clinked every time they shifted in their chairs. None of them paid her any more attention than that, and she did not expect them to. She was nearly finished with her meal when the door opened, and a man came in from the street, and even though she was looking out the window at the time, something about the way the light changed in the room made her glance up. He was not the tallest man she had ever seen, but he carried himself like he was, with the straight-backed ease of someone who had learned early that the ground was solid beneath his feet, and there was no particular reason to hunch against the world. He was perhaps 28 or 29, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that was not clean-shaven but not exactly a full beard either, just the shadow of a man who had been busy with other things for the past several days. He wore a rancher's clothes, not fancy but good quality, and his boots were worn at the heel in the way of someone who walked a great deal over rough ground. He had a quiet face, the kind that did not announce itself but simply was, and his eyes were brown, dark brown, the kind that took in a room all at once without making a show of it. He came in and spoke to the woman serving the tables, and she heard him say he would have whatever was hot, and then he looked around for a seat. All the tables had people at them. He looked at the table near the window, which was Matilda's, and saw her sitting there with her nearly empty bowl in her folded hands, and he pulled out the chair across from her and said, "If you do not mind, miss." "I do not," she said. He sat down. He did not look past her the way most men did. He looked at her specifically, the way you look at a person you are actually seeing, and then he said, "Long road in." 3 days from Ellsworth, she said. "You." 2 days from the Cheyenne River country, he said. "Business in town." "As is everyone," she said. He smiled a little at that, just the corner of his mouth, and it changed his face considerably, made it warmer, made the lines beside his eyes show themselves. "Henry Shepard," he said, and extended his hand across the table the way men sometimes did with women in the West, which was different from the East, where women were expected to offer a hand or not, and he seemed to do it without thinking about the etiquette either way, which she liked. "Matilda Kendrick," she said, and shook it. His hand was calloused and warm, and he did not squeeze too hard or too soft. "What brings you to Caldwell, Miss Kendrick?" "My father left me some land and some debt," she said. "I've come to sort out which is going to win." He looked at her with what she could only describe as attention, real attention, the kind that did not slide away looking for something more interesting. "And which do you think it will be?" "The land," she said, because she had to believe that or there was no point in being here at all. "Good answer," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not condescension, which was what she usually got when she said determined things to men. It was something more like recognition. His food came and he ate and they talked, more than she had expected to. He told her he had come to Caldwell to sell 2 horses to a buyer who had been recommended to him by a man in Abilene, and that he ran a small ranch northeast of the territory with his younger brother, who was 17 and still learning. She told him about the land and the bank and the deadline, and he listened to all of it with the same steady attention he had offered from the start. When she rose to go, he stood as well, which was not something every man did, and he said, "I hope the banker is reasonable with you, Miss Kendrick." "I hope so too," she said. "Good luck with your horses, Mr. Shepard." She walked out into the afternoon sun, and she did not let herself think about him again until she was standing in front of the first bank of Caldwell, straightening her collar. Mr. Forsyth was not, as it turned out, a particularly reasonable man, but he was a practical one, and those could sometimes be handled better than the reasonable ones, because they responded to numbers rather than to feelings. He was in his 50s, heavyset, with a watch chain that caught the light when he breathed, and he looked at Matilda the way men in that position always looked at women who came in alone, with a mixture of polite skepticism and impatience. She laid the papers on his desk. She told him what she intended. He told her the debts were $112 total, that she had 30 days to begin a repayment plan or demonstrate the means to repay in full, and that the land could not be sold from under her during that time because the title was clear and the law was clear. She listened to all of this and asked 3 questions, all of which were practical, and he answered them and looked slightly surprised that she had them. By the end of the meeting, she had agreed to begin payments of $20 at the end of the first harvest season, with a formal letter of agreement that the bank would hold the land deed as collateral, but could not dispose of it for 18 months while she worked the property. She walked out of the bank into the slant of late afternoon sun and felt the particular relief of a battle begun rather than postponed. She would have felt entirely satisfied with the day except that when she reached the corner of Kisham Street, she nearly collided with a man coming the other way, and it was Henry Shepard, and she had the sudden strange feeling of something clicking into place, the way a gate latch does when the wind has been blowing it loose all day, and finally the post shifts just right and the pin drops home. "Miss Kendrick," he said, and his face did that thing again, the corner of the mouth thing. "Did the banker treat you fairly?" "Fairly enough," she said. "The horses." "Sold," he said. "Better price than I expected." Buyer brought his son along and the boy fell in love with the bay mare, so the father paid a premium to seal the deal. "That is a good day," she said. "It is," he said. He paused and looked up the street and then back at her and said, "I wonder if you would allow me to buy you a cup of coffee, Miss Kendrick. I do not often get to have a conversation worth having in a town like this, and today I have had one, and I find I am reluctant to let the evening close on it." It was the most words he had strung together at once, and she could tell from the slight pause before them that he had thought about whether to say them. She looked at him for a moment, this man who looked at her the way no one looked at her, as if she were a specific person and not just a woman-shaped space in his vicinity. "Yes," she said, "I would allow that." They went to the small coffee house on the side street behind the hotel, which was darker than the restaurant and quieter, with a pot-bellied stove in the corner that was not quite necessary in late May but was pleasant anyway. They sat across from each other and drank strong coffee and talked for 2 hours, until the woman behind the counter began blowing out the oil lamps on the far wall as a gentle hint. She learned that he had come to Kansas from Missouri, where he had grown up on his grandfather's farm, that his parents had died within a year of each other, his father of fever and his mother of what he called simply grief, which she understood to be both medically accurate and emotionally true. That he had raised his younger brother Samuel since the boy was 12, which meant he had been doing it for 5 years, which meant he had taken it on when he himself was only 23 or so. That the ranch northeast of the territory was 60 acres of reasonably good land along a creek that ran most of the year, and that he had a small herd and 2 working horses, and a kitchen garden that Samuel tended with unexpected enthusiasm. She told him about Ellsworth, where she had been living these past 4 years working as a seamstress for a dress shop, which was steady work but never enough. She told him her father had come to Kansas before her, and she had planned to join him when she had saved enough. But the years had moved the way years do, sliding past before you could properly count them, and now she was here and he was not. She told him she could grow things that her mother had taught her, and that she was not afraid of hard work or early mornings or the kind of silence that settles over flat land in August when everything is too hot to move. He listened to all of it. He asked questions. He did not offer advice she had not asked for, which was rarer in a man than it ought to have been. When they finally stood to go, outside on the dark street with the lanterns making pools of yellow light on the dust, he took his hat off and turned it in his hands and said, "Your land, the 12 workable acres. What do you intend to plant?" "Sorghum," she said. "Maybe some wheat if I can get the ground ready in time." "The soil there is good. My father wrote about it." He nodded slowly. "I know that stretch of land northeast quarter past Miller's Creek. My ranch borders it to the east." She looked at him. "You are my neighbor." "It appears so," he said, and there was something in his voice careful and quiet like a man who is aware of the significance of information he has just received. "Then I will likely see you again, Miss Kendrick." "Yes," she said. "You will." She walked back to the hotel, and this time she did let herself think about him, all the way up the stairs and into her room, where she sat on the bed and looked at the ceiling and felt the strange, unfamiliar warmth of being seen. She moved onto the land 3 days later, which was as quickly as she could get the wagon loaded with basic supplies from the dry goods store, and the arrangement settled at the hotel. The cabin was smaller than she had imagined from her father's letters, one main room with a loft that had been used for storage, and a lean-to kitchen added to the back. The well was good. She dropped a pail and the water came up cold and clear, which was the first genuinely wonderful thing that had happened in some weeks. The barn was a real barn, not just a shed, with 3 stalls and a hay loft, and it was in better shape than the cabin because her father had always prioritized his animals, which was a sensible order of priorities in that country. She spent the first day cleaning, because you could not live in a place that had been shut up all spring without cleaning it first, and she was methodical about it in the way her mother had been. She aired the mattress in the loft, which turned out to be reasonably serviceable. She scrubbed the floor with the hard brush she had brought from Ellsworth. She found her father's tools in the lean-to, a good spade and a hoe and a post maul, and laid them out in order. She found a tin of dried beans on the shelf that were still good, and cooked them for her supper on the iron stove that needed a new section of stovepipe but was otherwise intact. On the second day, she began walking the land. She was not a farmer by training, but she was her mother's daughter, and her mother had known soil the way some women knew fabric, by feel and smell, and the particular way it responded under pressure. She knelt in the field and took up handfuls of it, worked it between her fingers, and she felt the good dark loam of it, not the poor clay soil she had feared. The 12 acres her father had been working were laid out in a rough rectangle running south from the barn, and the creek that formed the eastern border was running, not full but not dry, which was everything in a dry spring. She was on her knees in the second field, figuring the rows, when she heard the horse. She stood and turned, and there he was, Henry Shepard, riding a gray horse that moved with the smooth economy of a well-trained animal, coming along the creek line from the east. He pulled up at the fence line and lifted a hand in greeting, and she walked over, brushing the soil from her skirt. "Neighbor," she said. "Neighbor," he said. He was looking at the field behind her with the same kind of attention he gave everything, taking it in fully before speaking about it. "You are walking the land. Trying to understand it," she said. "It's better than I expected." "Your father worked it hard," he said. "I saw him out here most years, 3 seasons at least. He was a quiet man, kept to himself, but he knew what he was doing with this ground." She had not known that her father had been known to the people around him, or that they had watched him work and formed opinions about him. It was unexpectedly moving, this small piece of information. "Did you know him?" "Some," Henry said. "Enough to nod to on the road. He traded a day's fence mending for one of my horses once, a few years back. It was a fair trade." She looked at him sitting easy on the gray horse in the morning light, and she thought that the land suddenly felt less lonely with him in the picture, which was a thing she had not expected to feel. "I am going to need a second horse," she said. "If I am going to work 12 acres, what can you afford?" He asked with the directness of a working man rather than the delicacy of someone trying not to embarrass her. "Not much," she said, equally directly. "But I could offer labor for it, or trade in kind when harvest comes." He thought about this for a moment, not pretending to think about it, actually doing it, and she appreciated the difference. "I have a mare," he said slowly, "young, not yet trained to plow but willing. I could let you use her through the season in exchange for, say, half the seed sorghum at harvest. If the crop is good, I benefit. If it is not, we call it even and you owe me nothing." She looked at him. "That is very generous." "It is practical," he said. "I have been thinking of expanding my own cultivation next year, and training a horse takes time. If she spends a season in harness with a patient handler, she will be worth twice what she is now." "And you think I am a patient handler," she said. "I think," he said carefully, "that you are a woman who walked 12 acres in the morning and is still standing at the end of it, which tells me something about patience." She almost smiled, actually almost did. She was not a woman who smiled easily, not because she was unhappy, but because her smiles had always felt like small private things that she kept for moments that earned them. "All right," she said. "Bring the mare." He brought the mare that afternoon, a young dun with a white star on her forehead, and the alert, quick-footed quality of a horse that was intelligent and knew it. Her name, he said, was Penny, because Samuel had named her, and Samuel had been going through a phase of naming things for what they looked like, and the dun coat had apparently reminded him of a copper penny in a certain light. Matilda stood at the fence and let Penny smell her hand and then her sleeve and then her shoulder, and Penny's ears went forward with interest rather than back with suspicion, which was a good sign. Henry watched this with his arms folded on the fence rail, not intrusively but with the comfortable ease of a man who had nowhere else urgent to be. "She likes you," he said. "She is reserving judgment," Matilda said, "but she is willing to consider the proposition." "That is more than most do," he said. She glanced at him and found him looking at her, not at the horse, and she looked back down at Penny's star and concentrated very hard on the texture of it under her fingers. He helped her rig the mare to the walking plow that afternoon, not taking over the process but standing nearby and handing things when she needed them. And when she had it done and looked at the setup critically, and said she thought the traces needed adjusting on the right side, he looked and agreed and helped her adjust them without any of the condescension she had braced for. Then he stood back and watched her take Penny through the first furrow of the season, and the mare walked steady and willing, leaning into the pull with good sense, and the dark soil turned up clean and smelling of everything that was possible. When she turned at the end of the first row and came back, she was breathing hard from the effort of holding the plow true, and Henry was still watching, and he said, "She is going to be a good plow horse." "Yes," Matilda said, "she is." "So are you," he said, so quietly that for a moment she was not sure she had heard it right, and then she was sure she had, and she felt the heat come up her neck, and she kept her eyes on the mare's ears and said nothing at all, but the warmth stayed with her through the rest of the afternoon. He came back the next day and the day after that. Not always for long, sometimes just to check the mare's feet, or to bring a handful of nails from his own supplies when he noticed she needed them for the stall repair, and once to help with a section of fence that was too heavy for one person to manage properly. He always asked before he did a thing, as in, "Would it help if?" or "Have you thought about?" which was different from the men who simply assumed you wanted their help and began doing things whether you did or not. He had the rare quality of being useful without being overbearing, and she found herself looking forward to the sound of his horse on the creek road in the mornings. They fell into a kind of rhythm, the way two neighboring people do when the land between them is not much, and the work is shared in small, practical ways. He would sometimes eat supper at her table, which she made a point of being good. She was a better cook than she let on. It was not a skill she had ever needed to advertise, and she would sometimes ride with him in the early evening along the creek to check the water level, because water level mattered to both of them, and it was easier to look with two pairs of eyes. Samuel came along sometimes on those evenings, and he was a good-natured boy of 17 with his brother's dark hair and a forthright cheerfulness that was entirely his own. He was respectful to Matilda in the clumsy, sincere way of young men who have been raised properly, and she liked him very much. It was on one of those evenings in late June, with the light going amber and long over the flat land, and the creek making its small, steady voice in the grass, that Henry said something that changed the shape of things. They had stopped their horses at a bend in the creek where a cottonwood had fallen in the spring and partly blocked the flow, and Henry had been watching the water find its way around it, which it was doing well enough, and he said, almost as if thinking aloud rather than speaking to her, "You have never complained once, about any of it." She looked at him, surprised. "About what?" "Any of it," he said. "The work, the condition of the cabin, the debt, the fact that you are doing this alone." He paused. "Most people complain, not necessarily wrongly. It is worth complaining about." "Complaining to whom?" she said. It was not bitter, just practical. He turned and looked at her directly, and the late light was on his face in a way that made him look very serious, the way people look when they are about to say something that has been waiting a long time. "You could complain to me," he said. "I am interested in what you are carrying." The cottonwood fell again that evening, resettled by the creek's patient work, and the water sound changed for a moment and then found its new path, and she sat on her horse and looked at this man who kept looking at her, actually looking, and she felt the careful wall she had built around herself, not from bitterness, but from simple self-protection, begin to shift in some fundamental way. "My father was going to come back for me," she said. It was the thing she had not said aloud to anyone. "When I was 20, he wrote and said he would come back to Ellsworth and we would travel here together. But then the winter was hard, and then the spring was busy, and then it was another year, and then another, and I kept saying, 'It is all right, I understand, I will wait.' And then he was just gone. Fever last October. I got the letter from the bank, not even from a neighbor, just the bank." Henry was quiet for a moment, then he said, "That is a hard way to lose someone." "Yes," she said, "it is." "And still you came," he said, "to the land and the debt and the cabin that needed cleaning." "It was his," she said, "and now it is mine, and I am not in the habit of leaving things unfinished." He was looking at her with an expression she could not entirely name, something attentive and warm and a little aching, as if he recognized what she was describing from the inside. And she remembered that he had raised his brother alone since he was 23, that he had buried both parents within a year, that he had brought himself and a grieving child all the way from Missouri to Kansas with nothing but 60 acres and the intention of making it work. "You understand," she said. "Yes," he said simply. "I do." They rode back to the cabin in the long dusk, and he helped her with Penny's tack and said good night, and when she went inside and lit the lamp, she stood for a long moment looking at the small flame of it and thinking about a man who looked at her as if she were worth the time of looking. July came hard and hot, as July always did in Kansas, and the sorghum went up like it was in a hurry. She worked from first light to noon, took a rest in the worst of the heat, and worked again from 3 until dusk, and Penny was steady and good, and the rows were straight and green by the 3rd week of the month. Mr. Forsyth at the bank sent a man out to look at the crop in progress, which was his right under the agreement, and the man came back and reported that Miss Kendrick appeared to be managing her situation satisfactorily, which was all the encouragement she needed. Henry's brother Samuel came to help her 3 days a week during the summer, at Henry's suggestion, and with a small wage that she paid in food rather than cash, because she had very little cash but she could feed a growing boy reliably, and Samuel was always hungry. He was strong and willing, and he talked constantly while he worked, which she had initially thought might drive her to distraction, but which she came to find pleasant. The way the creek sound was pleasant, a background of living that made the silence elsewhere feel full rather than empty. Samuel told her things about Henry without knowing he was doing it, in the way younger siblings always do. He told her that Henry had never had much time for socializing in Caldwell or anywhere else, too busy with the ranch to attend dances or the community suppers that some of the larger homesteads put on. He told her that there had been a woman in Missouri before they left, a girl Henry had cared for, but that when the parents died and Henry had taken on Samuel, she had decided she did not want the complication, which Matilda thought said a great deal about the girl. He told her that Henry got up before dawn every morning and stood on the porch of their cabin and looked east, which Samuel had always found strange, and which Matilda thought she understood immediately, because dawn was the most honest time of day, and some people needed to watch it happen in order to feel prepared for what came after. She said none of this to Samuel, but she filed it away carefully, the way she filed away everything important, in the quiet, organized shelves of her memory. In the first week of August, there was a dance in Caldwell, put on by the town council to celebrate the completion of the new courthouse, and Mrs. Carver at the hotel had sent out word to all the surrounding homesteads. Samuel had been tremendously excited about it, and had spent a week talking about it, and he had clearly expected both Henry and Matilda to attend, because he had mentioned it to each of them in the other's presence several times with the subtle persistence of a 17-year-old who thought he was being subtle. Henry mentioned the dance to her directly the week before it, on an evening when they were sitting on her porch watching the heat lightning in the west, which was the primary entertainment of August evenings in Kansas. "Samuel wants to go," he said. "I know," she said. "He has told me 16 times. Henry smiled, and she had gotten better at catching that, the quick private quality of it. "He also wants us to go," Henry said. "Together." "I know that too," she said. "He is not as subtle as he thinks." "He is 17, Henry said. "He is not supposed to be subtle." She looked out at the lightning. "Do you want to go?" she asked, a pause but not a long one. "I would like to go if you were going," he said carefully. "I would not particularly like to go otherwise." She felt the warmth of that particular shape of words, like he was being honest about something that was costing him a small amount of pride to admit. "Then I suppose we are going," she said. He looked at her and she looked back at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything, because there was something in that exchange that did not require words, only the acknowledgement that something had shifted, had been shifting for weeks and was now close enough to the surface that the lightning-lit dark could not hide it. "Good," he said quietly, and turned back to watch the storm. The dance was held in the new courthouse, which still smelled of fresh-cut lumber and plaster, and had been decorated with paper bunting and oil lanterns hung from the rafters. There were perhaps 100 people there from the town and the surrounding lands, and a 4-piece band that was not polished but was enthusiastic, and tables along the wall with food contributed by the farm women, and a punch bowl that was rumored to contain something stronger than punch, which several of the men confirmed by their increasing cheerfulness as the evening went on. Samuel had disappeared within the first 10 minutes, absorbed by a group of young people his own age with the efficiency of water finding level, and Matilda had found herself standing with Henry at the edge of the dancing, watching the couples move through a Virginia reel with varying degrees of grace. "I should warn you," she said, "that I am not a particularly accomplished dancer." "Neither am I," he said. "We can be unaccomplished together." She had worn her blue wool dress, which was the better of her two, and she had put her hair up, which was the first time she had done so since arriving in Caldwell, and Mrs. Carver had lent her a tortoiseshell comb because she had mentioned she needed one, and the comb held everything in a way that was more elegant than she had expected. She was not transformed by any of this into something remarkable. She knew that. She had made her peace with it. But she felt like herself at her most deliberate, which was something. Henry had looked at her when he met her at the door of the hotel, looked at her fully with a kind of focused attention, and he had said, "You look very well, Miss Kendrick." And she had known from the specific quality of the words that he meant them exactly as stated, not as a polite formality but as an observed truth, and she had said thank you, and felt the warmth of it move from her sternum outward. They danced the second set, a simpler reel that accommodated the unskilled, and he was not a bad dancer, just an untrained one, and she was the same. And they navigated each other's rhythms with the same practical cooperation they had developed over the weeks of shared fences and water checks and evening conversations. And by the end of the dance she was laughing, actually laughing, at the moment when he misstepped and she compensated, and they nearly took out an elderly couple to their left. And his expression when he caught his balance was so perfectly composed and so obviously mortified that it was funnier than the fall itself would have been. He was laughing too. She could see it in the lines beside his eyes, and then it broke through into sound, quiet but real, and she thought she had never heard that laugh before and that it was entirely his, and she wanted to hear it again. They sat on the bench along the wall between dances, and he brought her a cup of the suspicious punch, which she drank and confirmed was spiked, and they talked over the noise of the band about the crops and about Samuel's evident interest in a particular red-haired girl across the room, and about nothing important at all, which was its own kind of important. At some point in the second hour, a man she did not know, a cattle buyer from Wichita visiting his nephew in Caldwell, came and asked her to dance, and she said yes because it was a dance and that was what one did, and he was perfectly pleasant, and she danced one set with him. And when she returned to the bench afterward, Henry was watching her with an expression she could not quite read, something careful and quiet and not at all jealous because jealousy was too thin a word for it. Something more like a man noticing the precise moment he understands what he wants and what he does not want to lose. She sat back down beside him and he said, "You are a better dancer than you said you were." "I had a better partner the first time," she said, and then immediately felt she had been too direct, but he looked at her with that warm, dark attention and said, "Yes, I thought the same thing," and the directness had not been too much at all. It was near 11 o'clock, late for people who were up before dawn, when they walked back down the main street toward the hotel, Samuel having been left with his red-haired girl's family for the walk home since they lived closer to the Shepard ranch than to town. The street was mostly quiet now, a few lanterns still lit in the saloon windows, and the night air had come in from the south, warm but less brutal than the afternoon, and she could smell the grass and the dry dust smell of the high plains under it all. They stopped at the hotel door and she said, "Thank you for an unexpectedly good evening." "I should thank you for the same," he said. He had his hat in his hands again, turning it. She had noticed he did that when he was considering something. "Miss Kendrick, Matilda," he stopped, started again. "I find that I am, over these past months, considerably more invested in your situation, in your well-being, your success with the land, than would be strictly accounted for by neighborly interest." She looked at him standing in the lamplight, this patient man who had never once looked through her, who looked at her the way the things worth looking at deserve to be looked at, steadily and completely. "I know," she said. And then, because she had never been the sort of person who made things more complicated than they needed to be, "So am I." He was quiet for a moment and she watched the consideration move through him, the weighing of things, and then he said, "I would like to court you properly, if that is agreeable to you." "It is agreeable to me," she said. He put his hat back on his head, which seemed to signal some internal resolution, and said, "Then I will see you tomorrow as I usually do, but with the awareness that we have established." "Yes," she said, "with the awareness that we have established." She went inside, and she put her back against the inside of the closed door, and she stood there for a long moment in the dark of the hotel lobby, feeling the awareness that they had established moving through her like heat lightning, the kind that does not strike but illuminates, and she understood that she was not as well defended as she had thought, or perhaps that she no longer needed to be. The courtship was, like everything between them, practical and genuine and consistently surprising in small ways. He brought her things that were useful, a good length of rope she had mentioned needing, a jar of good lard for the stove that his neighbor's wife had rendered and sold, and once a book he had seen in the dry goods store and thought she would like, which she did, and she read it in the evenings and sometimes told him about it when he came by, and he listened in the attentive way he did everything. He also brought her things that were not strictly useful, a handful of late summer wildflowers once, purple and gold, which she put in a tin cup with water on the windowsill, and a piece of smooth river stone he had found at the creek that was the precise gray-green color of her eyes, which he held out to her without ceremony and said, "I found this and I thought of your eyes." And she had looked at the stone and at him, and felt the precise quality of being known in a specific and irreplaceable way. She made him things in return. She was a seamstress, and she made him a new shirt from cloth she found in the dry goods store, deep blue calico with small white checks, and when he wore it to church in Caldwell the Sunday after she gave it to him, she thought it suited him so well that she had to look at the hymnal for longer than strictly necessary. There were evenings when they sat on the porch and the conversation ran to the deeper things, the things people say when they have established trust enough to risk them. She told him about the years of being looked past, about being the seamstress who everybody liked well enough and nobody saw, about the particular loneliness of being competent and unremarkable in a world that reserved its attention for the conspicuous. She said it plainly, without asking for his reassurance or his refutation of it. He listened to all of it, and then he said, "I do not think you are unremarkable. I think you are the kind of remarkable that requires more than a quick look to see, and most people do not take the time." "You did," she said. "I always look twice," he said, "at things worth looking at." She loved him. She knew this by August. She did not say it yet because she was careful with important things, with the things that once said could not be unsaid, but she knew it the way she knew the soil, by the feel of it, the smell of it, the way it responded under her hands. There was trouble in September, as there often was when a season was going well and the harvest was close, because good fortune had a way of attracting complications. A man named Dale Cutter, who ran cattle on the land to the west of hers, came to her fence line one morning while she was working and told her in a pleasant enough voice that he was interested in purchasing her land. He had, he said, been waiting for the Kendrick property to come available, had in fact been expecting it to come available since she was a woman alone, and the bank had clearly overextended its trust in her situation. She looked at him across the fence. He was a broad man, not young, with the comfortable assurance of someone who had rarely been told no by someone he considered a lesser. "The land is not for sale," she said. "Not yet," he said, "but the season is not finished and things happen." She met his eyes steadily. "Things do happen," she said. "My crop, for instance, is happening very well. I expect to have no trouble meeting my obligations to the bank this fall." His face went through something unpleasant and settled back to pleasant with an effort. "I would offer you a fair price," he said. "Mr. Cutter," she said with perfect composure, "my answer is no, and it will remain no. I would appreciate it if you would not come to my fence line again with this question." He went, but he went with the measured pace of a man who expected to return. She told Henry about it that evening, matter-of-factly, because she was not the kind of person who kept useful information from people who should have it. He listened with his arms folded, and she could see the tightening along his jaw, which she had learned was the physical expression of his anger, the way other men's anger came out loud. "Dale Cutter," he said. "You know him." "I know of him," Henry said. "He has been pushing against the smaller homesteads along the creek for 2 years. Milo Patterson sold to him last spring, and there are people who say it was not entirely voluntary." "What does that mean?" she said. "It means his cattle had a habit of wandering into Patterson's water supply and fouling it, and his hands had a habit of mending fence in the wrong direction, and one spring of that can discourage a man considerably." She looked out at her crop, the sorghum standing shoulder-high and green and good. "He will not discourage me," she said. "No," said Henry, with a certainty that was not just agreement but genuine conviction. "He will not." He did not offer to handle it for her. He offered instead to speak to the sheriff in Caldwell, a solid man named Marcus Webb who had a reputation for even-handedness, and to make sure that any incidents that occurred were on record. She agreed to this, not because she could not manage alone, but because she was not foolish enough to refuse practical support when it was offered in the right spirit. The incidents did happen. One morning in the second week of September, she found a section of her east fence down, the posts not fallen from age but pulled, and 12 of Cutter's cattle had come through in the night and trampled a corner of the sorghum field. She stood at the edge of the damage and looked at it with a cold fury that was more organizing than destabilizing. And then she saddled Clover and rode into Caldwell and filed a report with Sheriff Webb, who came out himself to look and agreed that the fence posts had been pulled rather than fallen, and had them replaced at Cutter's expense under the law of the territory. Cutter came to her porch 2 days later, and she met him at the door and said, "If your cattle come through my fence again, Mr. Cutter, I will send you a bill for every stalk of sorghum they damage, backed by Sheriff Webb's documentation." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him recalculating her in some way, recalibrating his estimate of what she would and would not tolerate. He left without making a scene, and his cattle did not come through her fence again. When she told Henry, he looked at her with that expression she had come to know, the one that was warm and specific and attending, and he said, "You handled that." "Of course I did," she said. "I know," he said. "I was just observing it." She shook her head, but she was very close to smiling. The harvest came in the third week of October, and it was a good one. Not a spectacular one, not the kind that made men's reputations and bought new wagons, but a solid, honest harvest that said the soil was right and the work had been right and the decision to come had been right. She sold through the buyer in Caldwell who dealt in sorghum, and after paying Henry his agreed portion and taking out the money for the bank and the cost of her seed and her supplies, she had $43 remaining, which was not wealth but was a beginning. She rode to the bank and sat across from Mr. Forsyth and made her first payment, and he looked at the money and then at her and said, with the air of a man revising an opinion he had held without quite admitting to it, "You have done well this season, Miss Kendrick." "Yes," she said, "I have." She rode home in the warm October afternoon with the satisfaction of a woman who has done what she said she would do, and the sky was the deep autumn blue that seemed to exist only in the high plains, and the grass had gone gold, and the empty fields after the harvest had their own particular beauty, the beauty of things finished well. Henry was at her fence when she got home. She had not expected him, and he was not there on ranch business. She could tell by the way he was standing, patient and purposeful, holding his hat and waiting. She pulled Clover up and climbed down and looked at him across the fence. "I made the payment," she said. "How much is left?" he said. "Enough," she said. "Enough to begin next season and have a little over." He nodded and looked at her, and she saw him gather himself in the particular way he did when he was about to say something that mattered. She waited, giving him the room to do it. "Matilda," he said, "I have been thinking about this for some time. About the right way to say it, and I have not come up with anything more than the plain truth of it, so I am going to say it that way." "All right," she said. "I love you," he said. "I love the way you think and the way you work and the way you see things, and I love the fact that you are not afraid of any of the things that are worth being afraid of. I love your honesty and your particular kind of competence, and the way you look when you are reading and the way you look when you are angry, which is very similar, incidentally. I have been in love with you since approximately the second time we had coffee at that side street coffee house, and I would very much like to marry you if you will have me, though I want to be clear that the offer of the horse and the fencing help are completely separate from this and will stand regardless, because I am not the sort of man who bargains with affection." She stood at the fence between their two pieces of land, her land and his land, and the golden October afternoon was all around them, and she thought about every time she had been looked past and looked through and looked over, every time she had been called plain by someone who had not taken the time, every time she had made her peace with being unremarkable to the world. And she thought about this man who had sat down across from her in a hotel restaurant and looked at her as if she were the most specific and individual person he had ever seen, who had never once looked through her or past her or over her, who looked at her slowly and carefully and with the full weight of his attention, and who had found in her exactly what she had always been but had stopped expecting anyone to notice. "I love you," she said. "I have for some time. And yes." He came around the end of the fence, because the gate was 20 feet to the south and neither of them was willing to wait for it, and he took her face in both hands with the careful deliberateness of a man who did nothing hastily, and he kissed her, and it was the kind of kiss that answered questions she had not known she was still asking. They were married in December in the Caldwell church, which was cold but well filled with the people of the town and the surrounding homesteads who had come to know them over the past months. Mrs. Carver brought a cake. Samuel stood up with Henry and cried, which he tried to hide and failed, and Matilda did not point it out to spare him. Sheriff Webb and his wife attended and sat in the second row. Even Mr. Forsyth from the bank came, and shook Henry's hand afterward with a look that suggested he had revised several of his early opinions about the whole situation. Matilda wore a dress she had made herself, ivory wool with a simple cut that suited her, and Mrs. Carver's tortoiseshell comb in her hair, which Mrs. Carver had pressed on her as a wedding gift. She stood at the altar and said her vows with the same clear, composed voice she used for everything that mattered, and Henry said his with the same steady, deliberate quality he brought to all things, looking at her as he said them, directly and fully. The preacher said the words. Henry put a plain gold ring on her finger, warm from his coat pocket. She put a ring on his that she had bought with the $43, plain gold to match, and when he looked down at it on his hand, something moved through his face that she thought was happiness so complete it had nowhere to go but inward. They moved into the Shepard Ranch cabin, which was larger than hers and better fitted for 2 people, and she brought Clover and kept Penny, who was officially hers now as part of the arrangement Henry had modified into a simple gift when the season ended, and Samuel moved his things to the smaller room with the philosophical acceptance of a 17-year-old who understood this had been coming and considered it more than fair. She rented out her father's cabin, with the land still in her name, to a young couple who had come from Tennessee the previous summer and were looking for their footing. She charged them fairly and asked only that they care for the well and the barn. They were grateful and careful tenants, and she liked them. The winter was hard, as winters were in Kansas, with the wind that came off the flat land with nothing to slow it, and the cold that settled into the walls of even good solid cabins, and the particular quality of prairie winter nights, which were either full of stars or full of storm and nothing in between. She and Henry sat by the stove in the evenings with the lamp lit, and sometimes she read aloud, because he liked to hear her read, and sometimes he talked about the plans for the spring, and sometimes Samuel played the harmonica, badly but with great feeling, and the cabin was warm and the wind was outside, and she felt the particular texture of happiness that is made of small specific things rather than large abstract ones. In the spring, she and Henry planted both properties, his range expanding to include the creek-lined fields he had been thinking about for a year, and her 12 acres continuing in sorghum with a section of wheat this time. She drove Penny in the mornings and rode Clover in the afternoons, and Henry worked beside her more often than not, because 2 pairs of hands worked faster and he had always been practical about efficiency. But she noticed he also simply liked to be where she was, which she understood because she felt the same. Samuel turned 18 that spring, and in May he announced with elaborate casualness that he intended to visit the red-haired girl's family, whose name was Calloway, on a regular basis, and Henry and Matilda managed not to look at each other for exactly as long as it took Samuel to finish his announcement. And then Henry told him that was a sensible idea, and Matilda said the Calloway family were good people, and Samuel looked slightly deflated by the reasonableness of this response. having perhaps expected more in the way of teasing. She was expecting their first child by July, a fact she told Henry on a morning in the kitchen when the biscuits were in the oven, and the light was coming in the east window the way it did in summer, flat and warm and golden. She said it simply, looking at him, and she watched the information move through him the way sunrise moves across open land, from the east of his eyes outward. He crossed the kitchen and held her with both arms and said nothing at all for a long moment, and she felt his heartbeat against the side of her face, fast and certain. "All right," he said into her hair. "All right," she said. Their son was born in February of 1880, in the grip of a prairie winter that was especially fierce that year, with a blizzard that had been blowing for 2 days before it relented just enough for the doctor from Caldwell to make the ride out. He arrived with 10 minutes to spare, which everyone agreed was better than the alternative, and the boy came into the world with a loud, decisive cry that Henry said sounded exactly like his wife, by which he meant it as the highest possible compliment, and she knew it and accepted it as such. They named him Thomas James Shepard, Thomas for Henry's grandfather and James for her father, and he was pink and strong and dark-haired like his father, and the most demanding small person either of them had ever encountered, which she suspected was from both of them equally. Samuel, who was 17 when they married and was now 18 and a full working partner in the ranch, held his nephew the morning after the birth with the expression of a young man confronted by something simultaneously terrifying and wonderful, and said, "He looks like an angry old man." And Henry said, "Yes, so he does." And Matilda said from the bed where she was eating her first real meal in 2 days, "He looks perfect." And both men agreed immediately and completely. The ranch grew that year and the year after, as Henry had planned and worked toward, the creek-lined fields producing well and the cattle herd expanding modestly to 20 head, which was the number he had calculated as manageable with their labor and their land. She continued to work her father's acres through the tenant couple, who had become friends by now, the wife, Clara Booth, being a woman of practical intelligence and good humor, who came to tea on Wednesdays when the weather allowed, and had opinions about everything from soil preparation to the territorial politics that Matilda found consistently worth hearing. The injustice of those territorial politics was real and present, and not something they could ignore, because living in Kansas in 1880 meant living in a place still sorting out what it was and who it was for, and the answers were not always honest. The homestead land that had been promised, and then partially given to settlers like her father and Henry's grandfather, had come, in many cases, from lands that had belonged to people who had been here far longer, and who had been moved from them by the kind of force that dressed itself in the language of progress. She and Henry talked about this on winter evenings when the lamp was low and Thomas was sleeping, and they had the quiet to say difficult things, about the Cheyenne who had been pushed from the Cheyenne River country Henry knew, about the Osage who had been in Kansas long before any settler's deed, about the particular price that had been paid by some people, so that others could plant sorghum and hold deeds and feel the satisfaction of a harvest. It did not make their own work wrong, but it made it complicated, and she thought that was right, that it should feel complicated, because easy feelings about difficult history were a kind of dishonesty. Henry agreed in his quiet, steady way. He was not a man who turned away from complicated things, which was one of many reasons she loved him. Samuel did marry his red-haired girl, whose name was Annie Calloway, in the autumn of 1880, in the same Caldwell church where Henry and Matilda had been married. She was a good-natured young woman of 18 with her father's practical streak and her mother's warmth, and she and Samuel built their own small place on the eastern corner of the Shepard land, where the creek made a bend, and Henry helped them frame it up over a long Saturday in September with half the neighboring men coming to help, which was the way things were done on the prairie, where you raised each other's barns because someday yours would need raising. Thomas walked at 11 months, which was early, and talked at 13, which was enthusiastic. And by the time he was 2, he had opinions about everything and expressed them with a confidence that his grandmother Matilda's memory of her mother, because she saw her mother in him sometimes, would have recognized and approved of. The second child came in the spring of 1882, a girl this time, whom they named Eleanor, after Henry's mother. And she was quieter than Thomas from the start, but no less present, with gray-green eyes exactly like her mother's, and the particular quality of watching the world carefully before deciding what to do about it. Henry looked at Eleanor the morning after her birth with the same expression he had always had for things worth looking at, full and complete and unhurried, and he said, "She has your eyes." "Yes," Matilda said. "Poor child." "No," he said, immediately and with conviction. "Those eyes see everything." She looked at him from the pillow, tired and warm and entirely sure of the life she was in. And she thought about a woman who had ridden into Caldwell with a borrowed wagon and a roan mare and $47, and the expectation of no one's particular attention. And she thought about how little she had imagined then of what was waiting on the other side of being seen. By 1883, the Shepard Ranch had become a recognizable name in that part of Sumner County. Not famous but known, which was better in the long run. Henry had built up the herd to 30 cattle and added a small apple orchard behind the house that would not bear well for another 3 years, but was already a thing of real beauty in the spring when it bloomed. Matilda's land ran consistently now, her tenant the Booth family having taken on more acreage as the debt to the bank was cleared, which had happened in the fall of 1881, ahead of schedule, because she had worked hard and the seasons had been mostly kind and she had not wasted anything. The day she made the final payment to Mr. Forsythe, he had shaken her hand across the desk, which was not something she had expected from him, and said, "Mrs. Shepard, I will tell you honestly that I did not think this would go as it has." "I know," she said pleasantly. "I was wrong," he said. "You were," she said, equally pleasantly, and tucked the paid receipt into her satchel and walked out into the October sunshine, feeling so thoroughly satisfied with the world that she laughed aloud on the boardwalk, which earned her a startled look from a passing drover, and she did not care one bit. She told Henry that evening, and he listened with his arms crossed and a smile that was not the corner of the mouth kind but the real full kind, which she had been accumulating examples of for 5 years and which still moved her every time. "Did you enjoy it?" he asked. "Enormously," she said. "Good," he said. "You earned it." Samuel and Annie had a baby of their own in the spring of 1883, a boy they named Henry Joseph, after his uncle and Annie's own father. And the elder Henry had looked at the baby with an expression that was complicated and warm and somewhat undone in a way that he was not often undone. And he had held the small person very carefully, and looked at him with the full weight of his attention, and the baby had looked back with the unfocused curiosity of the newborn. And Samuel had watched his brother holding his son, and looked very much like a young man who was thoroughly pleased with how things had turned out. Thomas, who was 3 and very conscious of his importance in the household, inspected his cousin with an investigative thoroughness and declared him acceptable, which Annie thanked him gravely for. Eleanor, at almost 1 year, was not interested in the cousin but very interested in the wooden spoon Thomas had been using to bang on the porch post, which she took from him with surprising efficiency, and examined with the careful attention of her mother and her father both combined. Summer of 1883 was a good summer, hot and long and productive, and the orchard had its first small apples, not many but real, tart and red. And she made apple butter with Clara Booth one afternoon in September while the children played in the yard, and the smell of cinnamon and apples filled the kitchen and lay over the whole property, sweet and warm and completely itself. Henry came in from the fields in the late afternoon, Thomas riding on his shoulders demanding to be an eagle, which was his current ambition, and Henry set the boy down in the kitchen and looked at the jars of apple butter lined up on the table with a look of sincere appreciation. And then he looked at Matilda, standing at the stove with her sleeves rolled up and her hair coming loose from its pins. And he looked at her with that same full, patient, total attention he had given her since the first evening in the hotel restaurant, and she felt it the same way she always felt it, like the pin dropping into the gate latch, like the sunrise that you always knew was coming and were always, somehow, surprised by the quality of. "How many jars?" he said. 14, she said. "That will last the winter," he said. "That is the idea," she said. He crossed the kitchen and stood behind her, and she could feel the warmth of him, and he put his hands on her shoulders and said quietly, "Are you happy?" She thought about this for a moment, genuinely, because she was not the kind of person who gave automatic answers to real questions. She thought about the cabin that was now properly theirs, warm and well-made, with the sound of children in it, and the smell of apples, and the creek outside running east past both their pieces of land. She thought about Thomas's certainty, and Aliner's watchful gray-green eyes, and Samuel and Annie in their bend-of-the-creek house, and the apple trees standing in their rows getting ready for next year's real harvest. She thought about the banker who had been wrong about her, and the man with the cattle who had been wrong about her, and every person who had looked quickly and seen nothing and moved on, and the one man who had sat down across from her and looked at her, really looked, slowly and completely, as if she were worth every second of the time. "Yes," she said, "thoroughly." He kissed the side of her head, the way he often did, which was one of his small habitual expressions of affection that she had catalogued carefully over 5 years, each one a specific thing she had not expected to have, and found she could not imagine living without. She put one hand over his where it rested on her shoulder and felt the ring there, warm from his skin, and the afternoon light came through the kitchen window in its particular October way, long and golden and honest. Outside, Thomas had found a stick and was explaining something at length to Aliner, who was sitting in the grass considering the stick with serious eyes, and the orchard was red gold in the afternoon light, and the creek made its small, constant sound, and somewhere on the road east a horse was moving at an easy canter, and all of it was real, and all of it was hers, and all of it was theirs. She had come to Caldwell with a borrowed wagon and $47, and the expectation of no one's particular attention. She had been looked past so many times she had stopped counting, had been called plain by everyone who looked quickly, which was almost everyone, and she had made her peace with that and carried on, which was what you did. What she had not expected was a man who did not look quickly, who sat down across from her and looked at her with the full patience of someone who understood that the things worth knowing took longer than a moment to see, who had looked at her specifically and completely, and found in the looking something worth returning to again and again, morning after morning, year after year. She had not expected him, but she had known him immediately, which was perhaps the best way for the important things to arrive, unexpected and instantly recognized. The apple butter jars caught the afternoon light and glowed amber on the table, and Henry's hands were warm on her shoulders, and Thomas's explanation outside had apparently reached some kind of satisfying conclusion, because Aliner clapped her hands once, and the sound of it, small and clear and bright, carried through the kitchen window and settled into the late afternoon like something that had always been meant to be there. Outside, the Kansas sky went on forever, as it always did, flat and enormous and truthful, and the land lay under it with the patient confidence of things that have been worked well and loved honestly. And Matilda Kendrick, who was also Matilda Shepard, who had always been exactly who she was regardless of whether anyone was looking, stood in her kitchen in the warm gold of an October afternoon and felt the whole quiet, particular, irreplaceable weight of a life that had been built by hand and by heart, piece by careful piece, the way all the best things are built, not quickly, not carelessly, but with the full attention of someone who understood that what is worth seeing is worth taking the time to see, And outside the window the light was gold, and the apple trees were red, and the creek was running, and Henry's hands were warm, and Alina clapped her hands again just to hear the sound of it, and the sound was everything.